Greetings great guys, welcome to my take on What If Goku Was an Avatar. This story will take place a few years before the beginning of both shows. That is to say, when Goku was a baby and just about to crash on Earth, and when Sokka and Katara were only young toddlers. This was the youngest photo of them I could find, so that's why they look so old here, or like kids. But just know that in my What If they are actually younger, to begin with. But first of all, why, or even how, could this fusion of series even happen? Well, for starters, because I wanted to, but story-wise, let's just say that when Frieza blew up planet Vegeta, he got carried away and made his death ball a lot bigger. Let's say he really wanted to prove to the Saiyans just how fruitless their efforts against him were, by stating that he was only using 0.5% of his power, his true power, and then transformed into his final form. Yes, I know it's not very Frieza to do so, as he's lazy and likes to conserve his power or whatever, but to create such an outlandish scenario as Goku ending up in Avatar, we kind of need an outlandish catalyst. Anyway, the Death Ball collided with a planet, and the explosion somehow affected the other planets in the solar system. Almost like a chain reaction, despite the lack of oxygen out there. The chain reaction would then grow more and more and finally reach the sun of the solar system. The sun would then collapse and create a black hole, sucking everything into it, including the different planet remains and rubble, as well as Frieza himself. He had survived the actual planets going off, as we know he can survive, well, planets exploding, because on Namek he was on it, and damaged for that matter. But anyway, a black hole though, not a chance. The only survivor would be Goku. Or I suppose Kakarot really, because he's not, never mind. His space pod would have almost made it out of the danger zone, considering how fast those pods are. Black holes are very strong though, and are said to have even trillions of Gs. The space pod would be balancing on the outer edge of the black hole's pull force, a bit like how things went down in the original Dragon Ball Z when Goku's spaceship was being pulled in by that star when he tried to get to Namek. The pod and the black hole would fight for some time until suddenly, and very unexpectedly, the black hole would suck itself up, for no reason at all other than plot, and slingshot Goku's pod into a wormhole, tossing him into the wonderful world of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Let's get into the actual story. Goku's pod, Kakarot's pod, would come shooting down like a meteor, scaring some of the elders in a certain southern water tribe. They had heard stories about how the Fire Nation had taken advantage of something similar in the past. Of course, they didn't know that this was just a space pod and not a meteor. Nor did they realise that a meteor wouldn't actually grant firebenders extra power like the comet. And also Sozin's comet is kind of very unrealistic for returning at all, but anyway, Avatar and Dragon Ball Z aren't realistic in any case, so let's continue. A loud crash would be heard as Goku's pod would hit the ground, or snow, or ice, or whatever you want to call it. This was quite a few kilometres away from the village, and would therefore not disrupt the lives of the villagers, well, at least not yet, other than scare them of course. Back at the pod, Kakarot would awake. I'd say crash landing is far superior to any alarm clock out there, provided you don't die. It would be a bit awkward getting out of the pod at first, because it was partially stuck in the snow, but I believe he'd make it out by himself eventually, naked and cold. Yes, I'm going with the original version here, and not the later one where he's seen wearing Saiyan armor. So, he'd get out, but his instincts would tell him to get back inside quite quickly, as, despite the cramped up space, it was at least warm in there. Before he could though, he would slip on the icy snow and fall backwards, landing on a floating piece of ice in the water, many meters below the pod. This would be enough to knock him out, and normally would have killed him. Passing out naked on ice in the South Pole as a baby, it's kind of lethal, Saiyan or not. Well, unless you're Brody, of course. But fortunately for him, the villagers would find him 20 minutes later. Now, a normal baby would probably have died from the cold and definitely died from the 20-meter drop. But this is Kakarot, so he just got a bad headache and mild skin damage. Oh, and let's not forget the most important part of all. Now, change of hearts, being a good boy. I don't think the villagers would have found the pod though, because It's many meters above them, on a cliff, and half buried in the snow. Not to mention, all the attention would be on Kakarot. They wouldn't know what space pod was, so they wouldn't think, oh, he must have come from outer space and gone looking for it or anything like that. The more plausible answer to them would be that some horrible parent ditched him, or perhaps that the parents fell into the water and drowned. Regardless if it was an accident or not, they would all think poorly of the parents. I mean, who brings a baby out in these climates naked, or practically naked? Not even the Fire Nation was that cruel. Speaking of which, some of the Fire Nation soldiers are scheduled to arrive at the South Pole in a few years, and I'm not talking about Zuko. Anyway, the villagers would bring Kakarot back to camp and nurse him back to health, as well as take him in as one of their own. Obviously, they would find the tale very, or at least a bit, odd, but considering there are all sorts of mixed animals such as turtle, ducks, and other things in the world, I think they would accept him anyway. I don't think most of them would be super suspicious about him being Fire Nation or even a trap set by the Fire Nation, as not even the Fire Nation would leave their own infants out in the cold like that. Nor would Sokka be old enough to be this traumatized, paranoid leader who basically banishes people from the village for being new. No. Here, Hakoda, Sokka and Katara's dad, would still be in charge, and most likely be the person, together with Kaya, to take Goku in as their own. I mean, surely an event like this would have been the chief's responsibility. Besides, I'm sure Katara would have loved to have had a younger brother to take care of, much like how she wanted to help Aang in the original. Katara, by the way, would be around 3 years here, and Sokka about 4. This is because I'm making Kakarot 2 years younger than Katara, to match Aang's physical age later on. That means that Goku hit Kakarot here. I should write it up. He would be around 1 year old. Yes, I know, Google says he was about 3 when he crash landed, but I don't think he looked like a toddler. I think he looked like a baby, so I'm keeping him a baby. Also, just a quick useless fun fact I should mention. I'm going to be calling Kakarot Toku from now on. It sounds a bit like Goku, but has more of a water tribe-y touch to it. Like Katara, Sokka, Kaya, Hakoda, Tarlok, Hama, all these water tribe names sound very hard. They have K's, T's, and like the R sound in it, so I thought I'd change it and make it Toku. Feels more suitable somehow. Toku, being such a young boy, would obviously go to bed pretty early, but since he would now be living in the South Pole, he'd still be exposed to those long polar nights and the midnight sun as well. Meaning he would eventually have no choice but to face the moon. More specifically, when the moon was full. Just for the sake of not having the entire village crushed, I'm going to do them all a solid and say he transformed for the first time outside of the village. It was at the age of 3, on a fishing trip with his father, Sokka, and some of the other men. It would only be like 4 in the afternoon, but the full moon was still very much visible, together with the southern lights. Southern lights, are they the same as northern lights? I think they are. Never mind. This transformation would of course scare the living daylight. Not that there was much daylight during a polar night, but it would definitely scare them all. The transformation would be active for quite some time, and only once the moon would go low enough to be blocked by a massive iceberg would the boy revert back to his normal size. All of the men would come out of hiding in shock. Scary enormous entities like this weren't completely unheard of, in the world of Avatar at least, because they do have the spirit world with creatures like Heibai, and since there was a full moon together with southern lights, they would probably have assumed they had something to do with it, like the moon spirit or just the spirit world in general. What they wouldn't be able to understand was why and how their Toku fit into the mix. He wasn't a spirit, was he? Once they got back home from the fishing trip, they'd inform the rest of the village exactly what had happened, which would of course cause some of the villagers to fear Toku a little. But for the most part, things would proceed as normal eventually. I don't think they'd be like, let's cut his tail off, because for starters, that's a pretty cruel and brutal thing to do to a young child. Besides, Toku had shown how useful his tail could be when it came to fishing. But also, I think the bets would probably be more on the full moon. Maybe it was a very spiritual polar night, and Toku perhaps just was more susceptible to possession. The best thing he could do would be to not expose him to such spiritual circumstances again. So just like that, he wouldn't transform for many more years. Sokka, Katara and Toku would start to grow up together, and he'd be just as much their sibling as they were each other's. Toku's strength at this point wouldn't be anything too out of the ordinary, not yet at least. I mean, he only had a power level of like 10 in the original, and that was at the age of 12, having received training from his grandpa Gohan. Here, he would be around 6, and he wouldn't have done the same type of training. It would only be like basic combat training with Sokka and his dad. Keep in mind, this isn't any flashy martial arts with energy beams, it's just plain old Water Tribe fighting style. Boomerangs and spears. He hasn't been introduced or exposed to superhuman martial arts yet, and that's why his power's just around 3 or 4 perhaps. Now that's still pretty high for a 6-year-old child, if we compare it to the old farmer from the original Dragon Ball. I think it was around 5, which makes 4 pretty impressive. So Hakoda would definitely have noticed his promising power, for sure. He would even be a bit stronger than his older brother, Sokka, who would be around 9 years old. This would make Sokka a little bit jealous, but at the same time he'd be kind of proud, and get humbled a lot earlier on. Katara at this point would not be any good at waterbending. We all know how rubbish she was in the original before she left the South Pole, and here she was only 8, so no good. But she was aware that she was a bender and the last one in her tribe. Because of this, Toku would not have had the chance to witness any wild bending yet, and therefore would not have attempted to replicate his own version, like he did with the Kamehameha wave. He would, however, know of the 4 nations, and that there were benders and non-benders out there, and that his sister was a waterbender, of course. They just assumed that he was one of the non-benders, just like everyone else in the village. Which is true, he isn't a bender, even if the original Goku does know how to manipulate the elements thanks to telekinesis and ki and stuff like that. Goku in this Toku, has an incredible potential and natural talent for growing and learning abilities and techniques. But he was born with very little, and this is why he isn't stronger yet. He is somewhat limited to the village's fighting level. Anyway, enough talk about that, because we have an invasion to deal with, and it's none other than the Southern Raiders commander, John Ra, and his men. The commander had gotten news some time ago about one last hidden waterbender somewhere in the Southern Water Tribe, and he would see to it that they were dealt with. Back in the village, everything was going as usual. The 3 siblings were playing together, having a snowball fight, but suddenly they all froze. The whole village did. What was this black snow falling from the sky? The older warriors knew and started preparing for battle. It wasn't long before the Fire Navy came crashing into the snow walls surrounding the village with their fleets and began their search. Katara at this time was of course inside the family house, or tent, or igloo, with her mum, who was pleading with Yanra, or Yanra, I'm not sure what he's called, trying to convince him that there was no more waterbender in the village, while Sokka and Toku were battling outside. Well, Toku was. Sokka was more in the background, throwing snowballs at soldiers who had already been taken down. This was Toku's first time witnessing real bending. Not just the usual floating water drops his sister tried with great difficulty to control. No, this was actual fireballs and fire blasts, attacks capable of doing real damage. It was both terrifying, well, having your village attacked and all, but at the same time, mesmerizing. It got the young boy inspired, in an odd way he hadn't been before. This was of course his same blood pumping, him wanting a good battle, a real battle. Of course, he knew that this wasn't a joke, but he couldn't help but feel excited. Now, Toku, with a power level of around 4, and some form of Water Tribe fighting experience, wasn't useless out there. I mean, he wasn't the strongest, far from it, and his dad would probably not have wanted him to be in the heart of the battle, but he could somewhat take care of himself against the weaker non-benders, especially with the help of the older men, as they were warriors. It was a tough battle, but much like Sokka says in the original, as quickly as they came, they just left. I can't do an American soccer voice, sorry. And so, the tribe celebrated their victory. Well, that's until they found out what really happened. This was a dark day indeed, and would cause the family a lot of pain. The scene inside the house was one that would haunt Katara and Hakoda for life. I believe they were the first people on scene in the original, so I'm keeping it this way in my what if too. I don't think Hakoda would have let Sokka and Toku see it though, as they weren't there yet, and he still had time to prevent another one of his kids from this kind of trauma. After having fallen onto his knees in utter disbelief, he quickly got up, pulled Katara away from Kaya, and led her out the house. Once outside, he found his sons running towards the entrance, but stopped them in a massive sorrowful hug, blocking the entrance, though it was pretty obvious that something had happened by the looks on Katara's and Hakoda's faces. Toku and Katara, as well as Sokka, sorry Sokka, I forgot you, had just lost their mother. There was nothing they could do about it, but grieve. Toku, being a Dragon Ball character, probably screamed after finding out what happened, and this would have of course made his power level peak at 7 or 8 for a short while, but other than that, nothing had changed. In the years that followed, right before the men left for war, so a couple of years before Aang originally made his appearance, Toku made an impact on his siblings. We all know how he originally reacts when he loses fights, Goku that is, but lives to tell the tale. Heck, even if he dies, he still acts the same way. He always gets more motivated to train extra hard and become even stronger. So that's just what Toku does here too. Although they weren't necessarily beaten per se by the Fire Nation, it still felt that way due to the loss of Kaya. So thanks to Toku training much harder, and even trying to replicate the firebending he saw, despite knowing he wasn't a bender, and definitely not of the fire sorts, Katara and Sokka would also have improved and were more active. Sokka here was now a tiny bit stronger than his original counterpart would have been at this age, but mostly it was his boomerang skills that had improved, as he is only human, and at least when it comes to Avatar, the humans do actually have physical limitations. Katara had also seen improvements, and her bending was about as good as when she met Aang in the original. Keep in mind, this is about 2 years prior to the iceberg incident, so the skills here were roughly 2 years early, if that makes any sense. Toku's skills had grown the most though, and in a rather weird way. I mean, sure, he had gotten stronger and now had a power level of 10 or 15 at the age of 10, thanks to having had people to train with and just thanks to having been more motivated. But that wasn't the weirdest part, not in the village's eyes at least. Toku had developed a type of energy beam, very much resembling the thunder, flash, attack we see Piken do in the filler episodes. Why this attack? Well, first off, it wasn't exactly the same attack, it was way weaker. But I think it would have looked very similar, just because this attack pretty much looks like firebending, which is what Toku based his energy beam on. Just a small note though, this is not firebending, not really. It may do the same damage as firebending, but this is very much a key attack, and not as easy to steer as firebending. Bending is smooth and all about control and shaping it. Anyway, Toku here, being so weak compared to Piken, was only able to produce a small attack, the same size as his first Kamehameha wave on that car in the original. Only here it would be Sokka's watchtower. At first, the village freaked out a little when they saw him do this, and Sokka also freaked out, but mostly because of his watchtower. Was he Fire Nation's spy after all? No, he couldn't have been. He'd been part of the village for almost a decade now. This thought was mostly just from the villagers not as close to him. Hakoda, his siblings, and to be honest, most of the villagers knew this wasn't the case, not really. Well, if it was, it at least wasn't anymore. Maybe the Fire Nation had put him there, but he certainly wasn't on their side. No, he was part of the Water Tribe. The village elder, known as Gran, or whatever she calls herself, had another theory though, and told the villagers, as well as Toku, what she had been pondering. I believe that Toku, may be the Avatar. And that will be it for this part. See you in part 2 if you want a part 2.